Welcome to the Technology Integration Information Management Network. I would like to start my channel off by explaining one of the most important concepts of project management, the topic of risk management. Before proceeding into additional assessment, one needs to define and break down the true meaning and definition involving the topic of risk. Definition: an uncertain event or condition, positive or negative, that has impact on one or multiple project objectives. Just from the word uncertain, one can understand the implied component that leads to probability. Positive or negative. In this context, one could further conclude that a risk can lead to either a negative or positive result. When referencing a positive risk, it can further be identified as an opportunity. Level of impact. Hints on the result this risk has regarding one or more of the defined project objectives. Finally, it is important to note not all risks can be mitigated. Within some instances, the best we can do is contain. As you can see, the concept of risk management is defined within the Project Management Institute PMBOK. I'm just humbly working to establish knowledge-based material that further touches upon these key concepts. Risk planning. This piece is essential to both project planning and risk management. This realm creates a great deal of work and attention to detail. It can be a challenge in exercising the diligence and thoroughness required to ensure that your mitigation plan is both all-encompassing and comprehensive. However, please rest assured, if you do your homework within your planning, you go throughout the project with the peace of mind knowing that if a risk does go into fruition, you and your team have performed the planning to execute a well-developed resolution. One of the most essential components regarding risk management is risk identification. This involves identification of risks among all project stakeholders. Different team members may be able to identify different kinds of risks. Just remember, when acting as a project manager, the expectation is not that you are a subject matter expert within any of these trades. However, you are expected to know how to facilitate these discussions. This alone may be a challenge depending on the receptivity of your stakeholders and your ability to maintain your project team's focus on these details. Sometimes it may be a challenge on maintaining your team's proactive focus depending on their personality types. This process involves keeping an open mind and utilizing these defined helpful tips and tools. Ask a lot of questions and ensure all risks are adequately tracked and documented. You can utilize a risk register to manage the documentation process. Proactivity is key. It is important for the project team to identify all project risks before it leads to an impact within one of the triple constraints. The risk register is one of the essential tools when assessing the collective risks of a project. It may provide you guidance within areas of focus. Listed are the key tools and techniques that attribute to essential risk identification. Interviews, expert judgment, checklists, and root cause analysis. As part of your review of this presentation, I request that you comment below some of the ways you as a professional within the project management field use these tools and techniques. This way, others may benefit from your experience. There are two types of analysis, qualitative and quantitative. This presentation will focus on qualitative analysis. One of the tools utilized within qualitative analysis is the risk register. This is normally an Excel spreadsheet or grid-based document required for tracking each identified risk along with key qualitative risk components. The risk register should be reviewed regularly with your stakeholders. The risk register contains some of the following key fields: probability assessment, impact assessment, risk rating system. This may be formulated in assessing the combined probability versus impact criteria. This can also be influenced based on an organization's level of risk tolerance. Risk mitigation and response planning. This is critical to minimize any risk to the triple constraints. The key components to the risk management plan includes the description of the risk, identification of the mitigation strategy, identification of the risk trigger, identification of the risk owner, the person who is responsible for monitoring and implementing the risk strategy, the documented change procedure, and the recording within the project management plan. Now let's break down each of these topics within the following slides. Description. The risk plan should contain a risk description, which includes definition of the risk and its background, how and when this risk is identified, and what makes this a risk. It should indicate the likelihood of this risk occurring, what factors make it more likely to occur. For example, if we assess the probability of rain, if it is a clear and sunny day, doesn't this reduce its probability? Impact. If this risk comes into fruition, what will be the impact of this event? Will it impact the critical path and schedule? Will it impact the project cost? Will it impact the project scope? Will the risk lead to termination of the project, or even worse, unfavorable consequences for the organization? These are all factors to weigh into consideration. The risk description may initially be obtained within the risk register. However, it will need to be expanded into greater detail. Mitigation strategy. As a project manager, you are accountable to ensure that every risk identified has a mitigation strategy. You must ensure that the solution is well vetted. Your project may just rely on the homework you perform during this phase. As a result, it is essential you do your diligence upfront while making sure the strategy is comprehensive. This is what leads us to these common tools and techniques: stakeholder analysis and expert judgment. I cannot emphasize how much expert judgment can positively benefit the risk planning process. For example, when leading a deployment within another country, there may be risks that may be outside the team's knowledge. However, if you have one subject matter expert whom has experienced this issue in the past and has properly mitigated, such a resource is literally invaluable. A comprehensive mitigation strategy must include the development of a trigger. I will further delve on this topic within the upcoming slides. Lastly, it is important to document the mitigation strategy's impact to the project timeline, resource plan, and any additional costs identified as contingency. Identification of the trigger. The trigger development process includes the identification of the event that will require the risk owner to put in place the executed risk mitigation strategy. Timing is also a key factor. For example, if your project has a constraint that is on the critical path, timing of that constraint may elicit the trigger. Important concepts. Understanding of the trigger is crucial to the project success. In order to make the trigger successful, the project manager must understand the impact that the risk has within the overall project. Then placement of the trigger must be accounted for in a way to ensure that the risk is averted. As a result, all components towards implementing the risk response must be identified to ensure timely execution. As previously noted, proactivity is the key. The earlier a risk is identified within the project planning, the less likely you will need to implement the project change procedure. As the risk is further identified deeper within the maturity of the project and within its execution, the more likely you will need to encounter the change control process, as it will likely impact one of the established triple constraints. Here are some of the previously identified tools and techniques within risk management: expert judgment and stakeholder analysis. Risk monitoring. The monitoring and control phase are contingent on your work performed during the project planning. As a project manager, your primary focus is on the risk owner, trigger, and assurance that your risk owner has the knowledge, tools, and focus to remain proactive within his or her monitoring tasks. Please understand, the risk owner is responsible but not accountable for the risk monitoring process. As a result, the project manager must continuously bring up all associated risks within status meetings as well as meetings with targeted stakeholders. You also need to ensure your project plan employs effective communication strategies to ensure the risk owner knows his or her role, the triggering event, and proper channels to communicate in the event the trigger threshold has been met. Listed are some of the tools and techniques associated with the monitoring of risk management. Technical performance analysis. This may be as simple as checking on status and threshold. For example, if we need to have internet service in place prior to physical rack and stack deployment of the technology infrastructure, we have to analyze tasks in play and remaining float. Reserve analysis. If we anticipate corrective action may be needed, is it sufficient in time or budget? If it is not for the successful execution of risk mitigation or overall aversion, then all that preceded is performed within vain. This leads us to the next questions. So what does this risk response execution process look like? What are the tools and techniques at our disposal? These topics lead us to the concept of planned risk response. The key is implementing your strategy into the project schedule. Let's use our previous example of needing an active internet connection ISP to ensure we do not impact critical path of the equipment rack and stack. To meet our critical path, we need for our ISP in place on April 22nd to ensure that we can commence the rack and stack of hardware on April 23rd. Let's say Robert is our procrastinating PM friend. He neglects to follow up with the selected vendor on deployment of our ISP solution. Though we executed the agreement for the new ISP and we internally needed it on or before April 22nd, Robert neglects to keep up communications. Finally, when following up on the vendor, they indicate that they can perform the ISP integration no earlier than the date of April 25th. That brings the project to 3 days of negative float, bringing us 3 days over our completion date. Assuming this deliverable is on the critical path and we did not get a change approved, via the example alone, we learned 2 things are essential to implementation of risk response: communications and execution of schedule. If Robert maintained constant communications with the vendor after the ISP contract execution and ensured to communicate the date of April 22nd based on the review of this project plan, this project would likely not be at risk in missing the planned completion date. Now this project will likely need schedule compression techniques to get back on track. Here is a list of tools and techniques that are utilized within the implementation of risk response. These are essential in adequately assessing as well as identifying opportunities that can emerge from existing risks. These may include a reduction in both cost and complexity, among other benefits. Expert judgment, strategies for threats, strategies for opportunities, contingent response strategies, strategies for overall project risk, alternatives analysis, and cost-benefit analysis. Risk mitigation and its additional impact. Though a risk mitigation plan may be both planned and integrated with precision, there may be unanticipated items that emerge as a result of this response. This is addressed within the upcoming slides. When implementing the risk response, it is important to understand the need for additional planning, monitoring, and execution to occur. This involves residual risk, risk that may remain as part of the mitigation effort. For example, you modify the setting of a wireless access point to eliminate interference. The solution may greatly reduce but may not eliminate the wireless interference in its entirety. Then there's secondary risk, a new risk that may occur as a result in the integration of the mitigation effort. For example, Let's say you had to modify your architectural design to ensure you meet your timeline. However, there is a greater potential security vulnerability that may emerge. As you continue to evolve as a project manager, you greatly see the need to develop for both knowledge management and lessons learned. This is further defined within the following slides. Knowledge management. Though managed project knowledge is a process accounted for typically within the execution phase of the integration knowledge area within PMI methodology, I would like to include it as part of this presentation. This is due to the fact that it is important to document data throughout the risk response execution. This data that is obtained and recorded may enrich organizational assets for years to come. I would like to thank you for watching. Feel free to comment and respond with any techniques you may have worked with and developed to help enrich your practice as a professional within the project management field.